Everyone, and welcome to the engaged discussion that we're going to have this evening about the film. I really hope that you all enjoyed watching so many components in that particular piece. We have an esteemed panel for you all this evening to engage in a dialogue and digest and uncover and dig a little deeper into some of those components that you had an opportunity to see. So I hope you all are ready and prepared to engage in this discussion with the phenomenal panel. I want to give each and every one of our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves, to share with you all their areas of expertise and how this film resonated with them. So again, welcome to this discussion this evening and this panel. We appreciate you tuning in with us this evening, and we're looking forward to discussing some of the major components and themes that emerged in this particular piece. Please make sure that you're utilizing the chat feature to make sure that you are typing in your questions and your comments. I see a lot that are coming in already, which is exciting. We'll make sure to elevate those and make sure that the panelists have an opportunity to address some of those particular questions that you have. But we will be starting with introductions from our particular panelists. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this space. I want to jump right in because we don't have a lot of time to be able to engage in a conversation. And as you all know, there are so many themes that emerged in that particular piece. I want to just start with introductions so that individuals can learn a little bit more about you, as well as hear a little bit about your expertise. Today, we will be discussing the film, but we want to make sure that we're centering it as it relates to your specific lived experiences, as well as your expertise. I would like to start this evening with, I can't see the.
I could get started for us if that's okay.
I'm going in and out, so please bear with me. I hope you guys can hear me. I would like to start with Dr. Stan Andres. He will be followed by Dr. Shamika Stanford, and we will end with Mr. Josh Ronover.
So thank you and welcome everyone. I'm extremely excited to be here and have this discussion with you all. So I come to this space as a formerly incarcerated person who, with multiple felony convictions, was sentenced to 10 years in prison. You know, I've had many encounters with district attorneys and prosecuting attorneys, and you know, that day when I was being sentenced, you know, I had a prosecuting attorney who was pushing for 20 years to life in prison because she felt that this young man who was in his early 20s had no hope for changing, and she saw me as a career criminal. Fast forward some time after my sentence, I am now Dr. Stanley Andres, an endocrinologist scientist, an assistant professor here at Howard University College of Medicine, former professor at Johns Hopkins Medicine, and an affiliate faculty at Georgetown Medicine. Clearly, I've changed from this perspective and prophecy that this prosecutor was looking to bestow upon me. So, you know, these types of stories that we've just watched are very, you know, I intimately connect. You know, I was being sentenced kind of at this time in our country where that tough on crime was, you know, at its peak. Mass incarceration was reaching its peak. And being from the Ferguson, Missouri area, I'm intimately connected to the policing that the rest of the world, you know, became familiar with. That was my, you know, childhood. So very excited to be here. Additionally, I come to this space as the executive director of From Prison Cells to PhD, which is an organization that works with currently and formerly incarcerated individuals to help position them and a place to obtain higher education and meaningful employment.
Thank you so much. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Shamika Stanford.
Good evening. Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. My name is Dr. Shamika Stanford. I am an associate professor in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders at Howard University. My specialty is I am the first and only juvenile forensic speech and language pathologist in the United States, and I focus primarily on the intersection of communication and cognitive disorders and how it may impact a youth's interaction with the criminal justice system, anything from coerced confessions to the impact of how they are treated in the legal system, life without the possibility of parole and capital case sentences. My connection to this story, as it's many stories, is that I'm from the South Bronx, and myself and some of my siblings at a young age experienced involvement with the justice system and how it can impact us. And like Dr. Andres was saying, that connection of the system not taking into account the brain development and the cultural differences that may come into play for youth is my focus and my passion around this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we'll come to our last panelist to hear your introduction and to tell us a little bit about your area of expertise and what brings you to the panel. Unmute, please.
Thank you. I appreciate so much the introduction, Doctor. My name is Josh Rosner. I'm with the Sentencing Project, a research and advocacy think tank in Washington, D.C., where I've been working for about 7 years in a set of issues revolving around juvenile justice. Generally, people who are under 18. That can involve kids who are charged and sentenced in the juvenile system, which is the most common. But we also see a lot of kids charged with serious crimes are not necessarily so sent into the adult system and into adult facilities. At the Sentencing Project, we work on research to explain these issues to the general public and also advocacy at the state level to change the laws that make these horrible and racist systems possible. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much. We're just going to jump right in. There are questions that are coming in. Please make sure that they continue to come in. One of the major themes that are highlighted here in the film looks specifically at the criminal legal system and how it incarcerates Black and Latinx people at a higher rate, as well as those individuals that are LGBTQ people and people living with mental illness. What do you think are the major effects of the criminal legal system as it relates to Black, Brown, Indigenous, and non-gender conforming communities? And what ways did you see components of the film merging with your work? So specifically helping us understand a little bit more about the disproportionality as it relates to those that are incarcerated in your areas, each of your areas of work. I'll come back to you, Dr. Andres, and then come down to Dr. Stanford, and then end off with Mr. Rosner.
So appreciate that question. It's extremely important to the work that we do at Prisons and Professionals. So an example of how that, what you are talking relates to some of the work that we do. Women are the fastest growing population of people who are incarcerated, particularly Black women. Black women, have a 6 times greater rate of being incarcerated than, their white counterparts. And, even more intersectionality to that, women, Black women, Black women who identify as being LGBTQ are not only a growing population, but a targeted population and an underserved population. So, we see and understand that, and, we're trying to elevate it in terms of advocacy and really uplifting or, letting that be known. But additionally, our programmatic direct services, we've just started a cohort that focuses on women and, the issues that they face and being intentional about understanding and directing services towards that.
Thank you.
Thank you. So extending on what Dr. Andres is saying, one of the biggest things that I think is not always readily spoken about when we talk about mass incarceration of Black and Latinx and Hispanic descent populations, and then within those populations, the representation of how you identify or choose to represent yourself in a space, is the disconnect between the education system and in a lot of the areas where we see the mass incarceration and the disproportionate representation of our race and our culture is in areas where the schools are under-resourced and the schools are not receiving the same levels of intervention and access that will set our youth up to become functional and successful adults. And so in that process, a lot of the mass incarceration population are individuals who are leaving, and sometimes not graduating, but leaving or dropping out of education spaces that have not prepared them for life. And so we forget to talk about how youth become adults. And so that discussion of mass incarceration, about 80 to 85% of the population that is incarcerated have documented disabilities. They have documented special education records. In addition to that, we know that in the carceral space and in the prison system, 95% of the adults read at a 4th grade level. And so mass incarceration is secondary to the implicit and systemic setup and bias that we're seeing in our communities that's not being addressed.
Wow, thank you so much for taking that deep dive and contextualizing that. Mr. Rosner, what can you add to that?
You know, I think Dr. Stanford touches on something very important, and the unequal treatment really starts from the beginning. You know, we see kids with learning disabilities, especially youth of color, treated incredibly harshly in school discipline policies. You know, kids who look like mine, you know, more likely to get, you know, after school detention. Youth of color are more likely to get suspended and expelled. And that sort of school push out, you know, makes it so much harder for kids to graduate. And of course it does, you know, they're not in class. So the deeper the kids then get involved in the juvenile justice system, the worse the outcomes are going to be. And I'm not comparing shoplifters to axe murderers here. These are similarly situated youth, that kids who are detained after they get arrested are less likely to graduate from high school. Kids who are committed as a result of their court proceedings instead of getting probation are more likely to get arrested and on serious charges later on. And what happens isn't only the way that the community views people and how hard it is to get jobs and how hard it is to get accepted to college or into the military, but how a person views themselves, you know, when they are arrested and treated this way. It dehumanizes people, and that gets internalized for the youth that we're trying to help here.
Thank you for that. I want to dig a little deeper on that. As you talk about these different nuances, specifically as it relates to race, what privileges do you think in the film Larry Krasner has as a white male, you know, specifically a white male DA, and how you think his race, his positionality, his gender, influence his personal theory of change and his ability to get things done?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll jump in. So, you know, I was thinking about that as I'm watching the film, and you know, being from St. Louis, after you know the events that happened where you know Mike Brown was gunned down in the streets and everything that came about in Ferguson from that. And one of the things that came about in Ferguson in St. Louis from that was Wesley Bell became the prosecuting attorney, one of the very few Black prosecuting attorneys across the country. Out of the 2,400 plus, 95% are white, and nearly 80% are white men. So I think it clearly showed, the film showed the record that he had in terms of prosecuting, or being the defense side of battling police officers that are brutally killing and abusing Black communities. So he's clearly aligned in that space. But particularly, I would love to see things of what happened in St. Louis with Wesley Bell, and since Wesley Bell, also Kim Gardner, who is the another Black female that ended up becoming a district attorney in the St. Louis area. I mean, less than 1% of district out of that 2,400 district attorneys are Black women. And, so I think that, this film should help us think a little bit more about that and what we should be doing to get more people of color in those positions. And I see a couple of good questions about, the prosecutor that prosecuted me. She ended up becoming a judge. She was a junior prosecutor at the time. She didn't really want to see me go to prison for life, but she knew that if she was pushing for that, that's what her constituents wanted. So eventually she can say, on her resume, she can say, I've sentenced 500 years of prison. And that's a good thing on her resume. And that will help her get elected. And that's a problem. And, I see there's a couple of questions around that. And I mean, that's a problem.
Thank you so much for contextualizing that. Does anybody want to add to that? Does anybody want to add to that?
I do, Dr. Muhammad. I think in reference to your question about, how does his race, gender, and his privilege and influence his role? I think, it appears on the surface to be very admirable that he took the stance, or he's taking the stance that he has stated that he would. I think, however, that being a man and being a white man in that space still places you on another side of the privilege. And of course, as professionals, we all have a privilege that separates us from our experience in life now. But I think, when we're talking about, for instance, when Dr. Andrews mentioned the increase of women being incarcerated, we forget, the privilege of being a white man and how men in the society adultifies Black girls. And so those disconnects between being able to directly and inherently understand the communities that you say that you're working for can still become a concern, because even though you are presenting as though you don't have an implicit bias, everyone still exists with cognitive biases. And so I think that the influence will kind of answer itself as we watch what his output is going to be over time and through the series. But I have, concern about those cognitive biases that are not easily separated from based on your privilege and your race and your gender.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Stanford. I want to stick with you. You mentioned in your introduction that you are the only juvenile forensic speech and language pathology specialist in the world. Can you please operationalize that so our audience is clear about what that actually means? And more specifically, hone us in on why that's so important as it relates to juvenile justice.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. Yes. So as a juvenile forensic speech and language pathologist, the work primarily is looking at the science and the records and the documentation that surrounds the cases that are presented in court. Primarily, a lot of times I'm addressing cases where the individual is either a youth at the time or was a youth when they received the sentence. And so this is important because as we begin to talk more about brain development, the concern that we have here is that the discussion around brain development is from the process of normal or typically developing individuals. And so we don't have a lot of conversation about what happens to individuals who have cognitive impairments, for instance, having autism or having Down syndrome, and even those very simplistic impairments or language and learning disabilities that impact their ability to understand or to recognize that what they're doing is a problem or not okay to society. And so my focus for youth primarily is making prosecution and the courts and the defense or their counsel aware of how we cannot separate the two, how communication is so ingrained in life that when an individual doesn't have normal or steady communication, how it can alter everything that they do in life and how that may have increased their involvement with school to confinement pipeline and even the carceral spaces.
Wow. Wow. So powerful, so needed. I was just recently reading an article on education in the DC jails and also in the juvenile facility, and they highlighted and looked specifically at juvenile forensic speech and language specialist and the lack of it in the system. And so we're starting to see this increase. I think this is such an engaging conversation. I want to come back to Mr. Rosner, specifically with your work around the sentencing project. What areas and what things are you all working on that connect with topics that were discussed in the film. I know that there are individuals in the chat that are interested in reading more, interested in digging a little bit deeper, wanting to understand a little bit of the nuances behind the data. Are there things that you all are working on that they possibly can begin looking closer at?
You know, we talk a lot in the juvenile justice space about second chances, but the fact is these are a lot of kids who never had a first chance. My role as an advocate is oftentimes putting together data that was available to policymakers in the first place. It's the reason I can do my job from a bedroom in Silver Spring, Maryland, and still have something to say to legislators in Indianapolis or Atlanta as they look at change. And the fact is that we see kids through the data who are getting arrested at very low-level charges, who nevertheless end up incarcerated for it, both detained before their hearings or committed afterwards in lousy facilities that have worse outcomes. So much of what I do is gathering data that's hiding in plain sight to encourage policymakers to change their laws to get the youngest kids out of the system, to get low-level cases diverted away from the system. That's one of the successes Larry Krasner has had in Philadelphia, not just diverting that first-time low-level offender. You know, this is a 12-year-old who's caught vandalizing. There's a really good chance that that kid isn't going to get in trouble again, even if you don't, provide any services. And to get those kids out of the system entirely is a lot of our reform. And what that means, as you have a smaller and smaller system, you can close these awful facilities that are home to abuse, that are eating up dollars that ought to be serving in the community, reaching the problems that are driving kids into the system in the first place, the poverty, the lack of opportunity, the lack of jobs. These are things that we have money for. And instead of actually spending on that infrastructure, we're willing to spend huge amounts of money to operate factories of failure.
Wow, thank you so much for that. Let's keep this conversation going. I think it's getting good, and we're starting to get into the weeds of things. I want to come to you, Dr. Andrees. You did mention in your introduction working with many individuals, large numbers of individuals who are incarcerated and actually navigating through educational resources from prison to professionals. When we think about prosecutors, when we think about the criminal legal system, what are things that you talk about and engage with your constituents as it relates to re-entering and hitting the ground running strongly?
Yeah, that's thank you for that question. I think partly what the system does has been very good and really very intentional about destroying people's internal beliefs of any type of positivity about themselves. So there's an extreme sense of being less than human. There's a dehumanization that's just entrenched in every different aspect of the legal system and the how we prosecute individuals. The prosecutor has to say these certain things about a person to try to combat the things that the defense is saying. And so we encounter people that are just, that have just extremely defeated views of themselves. So we really take a strong approach at building up self-worth and self-value. We do that by means of really getting, helping people find a sense of purpose. But it's important to really own your story. And partly what the system has done, I know when I was incarcerated, like my mom and family didn't want to tell anybody about it. They didn't want to tell other family. They didn't want to tell church members. They wanted to hide it because there's this stigma about it. And that is part of the way that they keep us caged in, even after we get out, is that we're in this psychological prison with ourselves. So we really try to help people understand that they have purpose and value in this world. They are human. They are loved. And, we really try to tap into that. We frame it as helping people reach their potential. But it's understood to them once they go through the process that we're building up this sense of self-value and self-worth.
Thank you so much for that. Dr. Stanford, I want to come to you to ask questions about the families of youth that find themselves in confinement and detention. oftentimes when we see the role of the prosecutor, a lot of the caregivers have this concept that the judge is the most important, and thinking with a kind of old school phenomenon. And oftentimes the role of the prosecutor oftentimes is not fully conceptualized as it relates to the caregivers to younger individuals finding themselves up against the criminal legal system. What advice do you have for ways of utilizing their social capital and really being able to communicate for their loved ones, their young loved ones that are up against such a big system?
Thank you. I think that it starts internally, or it starts within the families, because I think the build out is about first, building the social capitalism in the youth. Because again, remembering that how the process works is that counsel works for the youth, and the prosecution is working against the youth. And so even though your family is involved in some sense, the decision has to come, from the discussion between the counsel and the youth. And so a lot of times where the disconnect is because the families, we don't know the process and we don't understand what we are up against. We're not able to prepare our youth for what they may be up against. And so they are out in society a lot of times not understanding the role of their attorney or the role of the prosecutor. And so the conversations that have to be had in families is making the youth aware of the whole process, making you aware of what your expectations or what the ramifications of the expectation may be. So for instance, the prosecution is, giving a plea deal, giving that youth the knowledge and awareness to know what the plea deal may impact. For instance, our housing, if we live in public housing, it may impact your ability to enlist in the military if that's an option that you want. And so talking about all the other factors, but before we can do that, it is about preparing the families to be able to prepare our youth to succeed and be functional and able to advocate for themselves and build their own social capitalism.
Wow. I see you nodding, Dr. Andres. Did you want to add to that, or just connected to where she's definitely speaking facts and the truth as it relates to this dynamic experience that a lot of our Black and brown youth unfortunately find themselves in, and being in families that aren't able to necessarily communicate through that process is an issue?
Yeah, I just was in a lot of agreement in what she was saying, especially as she was mentioning my family had no real understanding, and I didn't either. And I had a pretty fair understanding of the legal system because I had been in it for some time by that point. But the level of power that the prosecutor holds, I was not quite aware of that only till later on in my experience. But yeah, I definitely connect with what you were saying about how the families are not informed, and that has an impact on the outcome.
Definitely. I want to come back to a discussion specifically around the film, where they talk specifically about Krasner hiring mostly outsiders from outside of the government, criminologists like myself, activists, defense attorneys. What role do you think outsiders have in government, specifically in their positions of power? How do we mobilize? How do we get other individuals outside of that realm to understand their power to be able to help in these sort of situations? And that's open to everyone. I don't know if you want to.
I could. Sorry to be jumping in first, but I'll be quick on this because it's just going to tie back to what I was mentioning before about the lack of Black individuals and this body of attorneys. So it's, there's a lot around how we get a Black individual into this elected position. But now that, he's in this position where he gets to appoint people, he has that power to very quickly change those numbers that we're talking about. So, I would love to see that, the people that have that type of power starting to appoint more Black women, starting to appoint even, LGBTQ individuals. And, that's one way that we could start addressing that, especially with somebody who has those views as he has. We can get him we can get those types of individuals with that power to help start to change, to move the needle.
Definitely.
I'll add to that. I would say definitely, absolutely, everything Dr. Andres is saying. And also, I think it is a very strategic move to do because in a lot of senses, you really can't get to the root of things unless you have your ear to the street. And so if you're getting individuals that are directly aligned to the situation, that's key. On the other hand, I will say that the part about you're asking Dr. Muhammad about how do we mobilize that, there's so much we have to unpack there. We have to first address, generational trauma, the trauma we have around what we think about prosecution, because, I never really thought about you becoming a prosecutor because I can affect change from the inside, because we have a viewpoint and an idea of what the system does to our families or what it has done to your brother or what it's done to your sister or yourself, so that process is knowing that one, there's power in numbers, but first we have to, address the generational trauma that has been done to us, because the system was designed while we were still slaves, and police were created to keep us slaves. So we had to talk about that process and start to literally to know the role that we will end up playing. But I think his move can be strategic and important to making change happen.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Mr. Robert.
I think for a long time, reform-minded people found themselves being public defenders or otherwise defenders. And we see how important it is to get people into the prosecutor's offices also, but that's easier said than done. People graduate from law school with enormous amounts of debt carried over from their undergraduate years and their law school tuition. And then these jobs in the public sector really do not pay very much. And so you're faced with the decision of whether to go into private practice, maybe work for a big law firm, or go and work for the community. And I certainly admire people who choose to work for the community, but the fact is that these jobs do not pay what you will for a law firm down the street from City Hall that working on the 18th floor at the prosecutor's office. It's going to pay far, far less. And that's going to be a challenge to overcome, especially with the debt that students are carrying as they graduate.
Thank you so much for that context. Mr. Rosner, how would you unpack this concept of the progressive prosecutor? In your expertise and from your lived experience, what are they talking about when they say that? Now, we see pieces of it in the film, but how would you describe that to our viewers that don't fully understand what is meant by that term?
Well, first, I think you have to understand that this is something of a marketing term, and voters need to hold their elected officials to the fire, not just for the promises that they make, but for the promises that they keep. So this is a vision about shrinking the justice system and putting resources to places that will actually make a difference on public safety. It's pretty easy to arrest people for marijuana possession. It's pretty easy to arrest people for loitering, but none of that is going to make us any safer. It doesn't do anything to solve the poverty that drives people into that sort of decision. So what a progressive prosecutor is capable of doing is not charging people in the first place, putting them into diversion programs. Restorative justice programs have been very popular and successful for young people. And that's not just for, stealing a backpack or something, but robbery charges. People are harmed when crime takes place. Even things that we can call victimless crimes, there are still people who are harmed by those things. And what we find is that people are much more satisfied by a restorative approach than by a confrontational approach. They feel more listened to. They feel that they're made whole. And the progressive prosecutors are much better at, or should be much better at, putting resources toward things that actually make a community safe instead of just upping the number of people in prison, which we know doesn't make us more safe. In fact, if the Lynn Abraham approach worked, we would be the safest country on earth. But we're not the safest country on earth. And it's because incarceration and policing is a failed policy when it comes to public safety.
Thank you so much for that. As we are winding down, I want to address one of the concerns that individuals put in during the session of viewing the film, and that is fear of Black and brown bodies. When we think about prosecutors, when we think about the criminal legal system, oftentimes it keeps those individuals who are melanated disconnected from the system, looked at as, not human, dehumanized, ostracized, discriminated against, and the isms just go on and on. In what ways can we begin to chip away at those components of fear. One of the components that comes up in this particular film is kind of utilizing this idea of the progressive prosecutor. What else do we need to do in order to reduce that fear so that we really see some internal changes in the system?
I think I'm going to jump in first this time, Dr. Andrew. But one of the things that popped in my mind is, and it has stuck with me and has been powerful in the movement. Dr. Wayne A.I. Frederick said to me one day, "You can't change culture without changing people." And I took that to mean literally, but also, mentally, emotionally. That first starts with changing the mindset and transforming the language around how we talk about individuals, how we dismantle racism and biases and stereotypes. That starts with changing the narrative around how we allow individuals to discuss us and speak for us. A lot of times, most of the research around this conversation and many other conversations are not written by Black people. They're written by white people talking about Black people, and that's problematic. So, a lot of this starts with changing that narrative where we're getting more professionals and researchers to dive into the work and to release content that doesn't always paint us in a negative light, that supports what we're doing, including Latinx and Hispanic descent individuals, and discuss all of those different factors of what criminalization, for instance, and what mass incarceration and what racial and ethnic disparities looks like from our side, so that we can start to change the narrative, and then that will shift kind of the focus of how it allows people to continue to look at us and decide what we are and who we will become.
Yeah, wow. Anyone want to add to that?
Yeah, just briefly to add to that, and the idea of we need more Black individuals in places of resources, power, and position to make change. The next addition to that is we need more directly impacted and formerly incarcerated people in those positions of resources and power to enact change. When we think about, it was just last year, it was 100 years of the women's suffrage movement. Who was leading that movement? Primarily women, and to be more specific, primarily white women, because we were at a completely different time that we're still battling with in terms of inclusion of Black women. But when you think about civil rights, who was leading that? Black individuals. LGBTQ, who was leading that movement? People who identify as that. So when we think about reform, prison reform, reforming the criminal legal system, why wouldn't we have people who've been directly impacted or formerly incarcerated leading that and being in positions of power and resources? So, I agree 100% with what you're saying. We need Black individuals, and we need people who identify as being, suffering and having the trauma of being impacted by the system.
Thank you. There's a question that popped up that's pretty intriguing. I want to give it to you all before we are preparing to close out. This one is specifically looking at the sentence commutation they attended. The audience member says, "What I found striking was that all of the incarcerated petitioners were white. How could this be, given the disproportionate number of people of color in prison? These were all murderers, not low-level criminals. Are we only pursuing clemency for white lifers?" And that was a question. That's a question.
I can't speak to the specifics of what this person witnessed there, but certainly we know that white people have better access to counsel, better access to the courts than people of color do. And that may be what was seen in the court that day. I will say that there's been great success on resentencing people who are sometimes called juvenile lifers, people who are under 18 at the time of their offense. The Supreme Court has sharply limited the ability to give life without parole to such people. And we are, in fact, seeing a number of youth of color who are no longer youth. They were under 18 at the time that this happened, but people are in their 40s and 50 years old who are people of color who are being released at perhaps higher levels than white people are. That's not true everywhere, but it's one of the things that I think Larry Krasner can deserve some credit for, is not opposing the resentencings, not opposing the releases that have happened in in Philadelphia, that matters a great deal because Philadelphia has been one of the states that has the most juvenile lifers, and Philadelphia, not only because it's the largest city, but because of people like Lynn Abraham, had a huge number of people sentenced to life without parole under the age of 18, 80% of whom were Black. So I think it is appalling what the questioner saw. I don't think that it's typical of what's happening in Philadelphia right now, but I don't doubt that it is happening in some places.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. As we are closing, how can our viewers continue following you to hear more about the work that you're doing? If you could please share your social media handles, any websites that you have, any podcasts that you have, so that individuals can continue to follow this conversation. I'll start with you, Dr. Andriese. I'll come down to Dr. Stanford, and then we'll end out with Mr. Rosner.
So you could follow me at Professor Andriese on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and you can follow our organization, Prison to Professionals. It's at Prison, the number 2 Pro, Prison 2 Pro. So we have plenty of ways to get involved and help out. We have over 200 volunteers that work with our program, so we would love for you to connect with us.
Thank you, Dr. Stanford.
Yes, on Twitter, you can find me at Dr. Stanford1. And on Instagram, I am at _juvenile_forensic_SLP.
Thank you. Mr. Rosner.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. The Sentencing Project is on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. You can search for the Sentencing Project and find that. I'm on Twitter at Josh Rosner. I'd also really encourage people to find their local organizations. This is built block by block, and you can find organizations in your state that are doing this work. If you're having any trouble, just don't hesitate to get in contact with me, info@sentencingproject.org, and I'll see what I can do to connect you with local organizations. But we would certainly welcome your support too.
Thank you so much. You all have engaged in such a robust conversation, specifically around your areas of expertise and also the documentary. Please make sure that you all in the audience fill out the survey so that we could know how we got it wrong, how we got it right, and how we can enhance it for the next time. We at WHUT would really like you all to also become a friend of WHUT so that you could learn more about the amazing programming that we continually allow for individuals to engage in. During COVID, many individuals have not had an opportunity to watch videos in unison. This gives you that opportunity. Thank you so much for tuning in with us. Again, congratulations to a wonderful panelist of individuals. I hope that you follow them on their social media handles and continue to keep the conversation going. Have a wonderful evening. Peace and blessings.